fetishization happens in both, from both within the community and outside of the community. It makes it so that a lot of AAPI folks are afraid to leave their house, like elders are afraid to go to the market or, walk down the street. After the Atlanta shootings, I know that a lot of people who worked in the same industry or just, worked anywhere in Atlanta, Asian women were afraid to go to their places of employment because they were afraid, the same thing might happen to them. And then AAPI folks also don't want to reach out for help if something's happening to them because they're afraid they're going to get stereotyped, they're afraid they're going to get judged or, have some harassment targeted towards them. So
I think also what we learned from Atlanta was a lot of people came, to lift it up. It was one of the first ones after COVID started, but it kind of got moved to civil rights and hate crimes versus it was women that were targeted and women who were in the massage industry, even from the family where people were like, we don't want this to come out that, my mom was working in the massage industry. I don't want this news to go back home. So we ourselves don't lift up the gender piece and the gender violence. By we, I mean we as a community. We are trying to talk about it, but yeah.
Something one of our friends always reminds us of, Aparna, what she always reminds us of, and she is somewhat an advocate from a South Asian agency in Atlanta, like right near where the shootings happened, and she always says, after something like that happens, there's always those like say my name campaigns, say their names, let's get the message out, let's show people, who they were and their story. And she says, I think in a lot of cases that's really helpful for the family, for the for the victim, and for the wider movement. But sometimes that's not helpful because a lot of times the survivor's family, I keep saying survivor, but it's, they were killed, victim, yeah. A lot of times the victim's family don't want their name out there, because it's shameful for the rest of the family. Especially in this case, the whole conflation of sex work with, massage industry, and everybody thinks they're sex workers, or, the whole like shame and stigma related to that. A lot of the families didn't want their names out there. And I think that's something that, should be a choice of the family, not something that's automatically, well, let's put her name out there and let's say this is what happened to her. Yeah.
All you may know is what is within the house. And we also know if you're, with abuse comes, first you lose your confidence. And the reality is if folks are financially independent, maybe the chances of standing up are a little bit higher. I mean, even if they want to leave, where will they go?
Well, that's for a lot of our clients that we serve now, and it takes a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of patience.
Right.
But it does take, this process doesn't happen in 30, 60, 90 days.
Yeah. Correct.
It takes months,
right.
Sometimes.
Years.
And that's the systemic piece of it. And let's say they even leave. And since you brought up the example of elderly parents are not necessarily welcome. Maybe it's changed, maybe in news they are, but they're not immediate family. They're not your child. Where will they go?
Right.
So it's not, if the parents are saying no, actually a lot of folks don't say no if they're here. The no comes from if you're in the home country, waiting to get the other kids married off and all of that. But if you're here, where do you leave them? You don't leave because your elderly parents have nowhere to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we talk about a lot, is we can't come with the lens of like, we're gonna get you out of this situation, right, and we're gonna get you a restraining order, and we're gonna get you housed. Like, that, first of all, we may not be able to deliver on all that because realistically, there's a lot of factors at play. That may not be the best option for that client. Maybe it is the best. I mean, I don't know who's to say best, but that may not be what they want. regardless of maybe what the best option is. So, you know, I think it's that whole thing of, you know, we try to have really realistic conversations with clients who are contemplating what they want to do, because if we were just like, oh yeah, come into shelter, like everything is going to be great, or, you know, I mean, we don't want to be like, oh, this is going to be really difficult. You know, you just want to have a realistic conversation of like, these are services that are out there, these are things we can help with, and answering questions honestly and not trying to sugarcoat it, because that doesn't do anybody any good. And we certainly don't, I mean, I'll speak for myself, I certainly don't want to be responsible for coercing in any way someone to leave a situation and end up in a worse situation by having done that, or having done it in the way they did it.
Some of the conversations that we were having with the shelter directors, the executive directors of shelter programs that I was with, really talking more about alternative responses and community responses, and thinking about those underserved communities that are more isolated areas or don't have that ability, like who do they go to, and how can we work within those communities to provide, if we're not going to be able to, if the answer is no, like then what can we do to build community for them so that they do have support systems, so they're not just isolated and alone. How do you safety plan, like okay, it's you and your grandma, but who else do you have? And that's when those other systems, churches and neighbors and knitting groups, you know, are the places. So anyway, just different ways of thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole like system of support that you're kind of, that they're in. Sometimes that becomes a system of harm. But we hear over and over again that healing has to involve the whole family. You can't just heal the survivor, whatever that means, and not think about all the people they're connected to, all the people that have also felt harm from the situation, you know, children, parents, partners, things like that. I think it goes beyond just like, come to our shelter, we're gonna heal you, and then there you go, like you're done, right. That sort of thing.
And I think, you know, I'm sorry, but that's something I think other service providers sometimes, they're making those promises, like go to news, they're gonna figure, you know, and I love that they're referring people to us, but I'm just like, like it doesn't, like, we don't just like put somebody in a little cage at the shelter and like force things on them. I mean, they are able to leave at any time. They don't have to agree, you know, we're not gonna force them to do anything. So just assume being in a shelter means like, or any of our services means like everything's gonna work out perfectly. Like, you just can't, you know, we can't make those kind of promises. We want to have realistic conversations.
But you're right, and probably like you talked yesterday about law enforcement referrals, they might be saying like, go there and you'll be okay, or something. It's really tough. So we're just gonna go through this section pretty quickly because we are, I mean, we're not behind on time.
Yeah, we just want to leave more time for discussion.
Yeah. And you know, you all do this work already, and I think a lot of this is true of other communities too, so this is probably not new for you. So going through it pretty quickly, there is a lot of distrust and fear for law enforcement, for criminal justice, civil justice systems, for the immigration system, from historical trauma, historical oppression. A lot of people have come to the U.S. from countries where, you know, law enforcement were corrupt, law enforcement did harm to them, military has done harm to them, their own government has done harm to them, and our systems in the U.S. have done harm also. But because of that previous experience, they have a lot of distrust. They may have a lot of distrust and a lot of fear. I know that I've also spoken to some communities where there's a lot of respect also for law enforcement, potentially coming from that, you know, previous experience and that previous fear. But in a lot of communities, there's distrust. Like, I don't know what you're gonna do. You're not here to keep me safe. You're here to hurt me. You know, experiences in refugee camps can create, you know, the same thing. And I mean, I say this all the time, but our systems are so complicated. I'm not, I don't have any legal background, legal training. I was born in the US and I was educated in the US and I went to college in the US, but I couldn't help, I don't understand our immigration system. Like, I don't understand all the 500 pathways to being a citizen and all the processes and waiting times and what happens if you have this detail that doesn't meet their qualifications. Like, I couldn't help somebody navigate the immigration system. If I had a family member who's coming to the US, I wouldn't know how to help them. And so for somebody who wasn't born here, wasn't, educated here, maybe doesn't speak English very well, and is in a situation of crisis, in a situation of trauma, how are they supposed to understand, the immigration system and what their options are? So our systems are incredibly mystifying, and so I think that's a big part of it. Is someone shared yesterday about how one of the big things for clients when they come and speak to news is that they don't know what's going to happen. If I tell an advocate what happens to me, is my husband going to get arrested? Are my children going to get taken away? Is there going to be a case open? And then, I'm just part of the process now. I think that's a real legitimate fear that a lot of people have.
And that has also been fed by the abuser.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, before I started this work, I didn't know what happened when in a domestic violence situation. I thought it was the police are called and then you go to court and then there's a restraining order and then maybe he goes to jail. That's what I thought. And I think, yeah.
Oh no, that's I think a big thing that I've heard from the community in general, that have called the helpline is separating us from law enforcement. So although the referral may come from law enforcement, that might be the first point of contact, knowing that we're not connected in that way, where it's voluntary, it's confidential, and it's led by what they want to do.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of people, when they hear about news, they might have heard it from law enforcement, they're like, oh no, I don't want anything to do with you because, or CWS, separating that, although we...
Child welfare services.
Yes. Sorry. It's hard because it is scary, law enforcement, child welfare services with the risk that your child will be taken away and what that means. I think one of the biggest feedback that we receive is separating us from law enforcement. It's huge.
So have you been able to have conversations with your law enforcement, the local offices, and tell them, please talk about us in this way and not that way?
I think it's hard because sometimes the contact is not as, it takes a while to gain trust as a law enforcement officer, so they can give the services, maybe the survivor isn't even ready to hear everything they're saying, or, the fear is just do I even trust what you're saying, or maybe they have multiple calls and they're like, here's a pamphlet for news,
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard because then when we just hope that they get to us and then we're able to explain oh, you heard from us, but this is the difference.
But you were associated with them from the beginning sometimes.
Yeah, we actually have 2 spots on our board for law enforcement, and it's an odd thing that we do, but part of the reason why we do that is so that we do have the opportunity to message can be a different response, and there are people who are not going to want to have, it's a way we bring them in so we can educate them, and it seems like maybe we're siding with them, but it's not that. It's really about being able to have a relationship with them where they understand how our services work.
Because the reality is that's how a lot of survivors first make contact with you or any supportive agency.
one thing I can add to that is back in 2004, when I used to work at a direct service organization, we shared spaces with a mainstream organization, so it was with Kathleen Next Door Solutions. And it was so different in the sense that folks walked in there for restraining orders, and I shared this yesterday. Our community was not getting restraining orders, maybe 2 out of 100, but most of them were being served with divorce papers. And then there was this big push for a family justice center and then an advocate to be situated there. And our pushback was, well, that can be someone from next door, the mainstream organization, and it worked for them, right? In principle, it sounds fantastic, right? You all also work with Monarch. You have everyone in one place. It didn't work for us at all, because you don't want to walk in and look at someone in a uniform. That in itself could be so triggering. Mm-hmm. And that means then, however much you say that we are the advocate arm of it, you are with all the systems. And it may not
That's
have
why
any-
it's and we keep saying it's an and,
right.
and it's not an or. It has to be an and, because for that very reason, walking into this, you can see when you walk into this space, the feeling you get is so different than when you, and our Justice Center, we're trying really hard to avoid that front-facing law enforcement piece of it, but right now that's sort of what's centering it. So
Yeah, it may work for someone, right? I may want to walk in and be like, oh,
Right.
hope or whatever. I think there's that piece. And the reason why we even bring it up is it's not necessarily distrust of the systems here or even law enforcement in this country the way it is for folks that are born and raised here. But it could be all the trauma that you're carrying from your experiences and the historical trauma you're holding with whatever you've been through in your own home country. So just that to say that it may not be you at all, or to just one.
Oh, I think most of the people who work here completely understand that
Right.
from their perspective too. Yeah.
Okay.
The only thing I want to add here to the language barriers is we go through this all the time. I know you said you use a language line. I don't know if you work with law enforcement for that as well, and that is a big piece. We
Yes.
usually have the harm doer or the children. I don't know why. In our cases, it's always the children that are used. And it's like, okay, how much more training do you need? Like, this hasn't changed over years. The compliance of language access, which is what we do even outside, you're a federally funded agency, you need to do that at least, it just doesn't happen. So I think that's what we want to look at.
I mean, it's hard, right? Like, you saw all the API languages. There's already a shortage of like Spanish interpreters in California, and that's like one of the dominant languages in California.
Apparently, the language line interpreters often are not very good interpreters.
Yeah, no, I was saying like we're so lucky to have it, but at the same time like,
That's
not great.
Obviously, it's better than Google Translate.
Yes,
That was
that's-
our conversation
But I learned that you can say, if the client isn't getting what they need, that the client can say, I would like to not speak to this interpreter, I want a different interpreter, so you can go
Who's going to
into,
say that?
well, we can help them say
it's
that.
just the whole thing, because you're reliant on this middle person
Right,
to, I don't know that they're relaying what I'm saying, I don't know that they're relaying what they're saying, and I can't even see this person to be like, are you feeling weird about this?
Right.
Because we're over the phone.
Yeah.
You know, it's, like I said, grateful because there have been times where there would have been nothing if we hadn't had it, but also like, it leaves a lot to be desired.
A lot of interpreters, translators aren't trained in like DVSA,
Yeah.
legal terminologies. There's been a lot of situations where a program brings in an interpreter, and the interpreter is like saying things, like not translating what the advocate is saying. The interpreter is also like victim blaming and shaming and things like that, because especially for like minority languages, there's only like a handful of people that speak that language. They might be from the same community, they might know the survivor, and they may not, if they're not trained in DVSA, they may be kind of replicating the same like, victim blaming dynamics that we're trying to get away from. So it has happened, unfortunately.
True story. It's happened where I've been like, do I actually stand up and tell the judge that this is wrong? And I did. And then it was like, now what? but we don't know. He basically didn't know that I spoke the language, the interpreter, this was in court, and he told her while pretending to translate that,
Right.
why are you doing this to your family again? Do you want him to go? And I was like, Stan, no Stan. That was not interpretation. And the guy looked really mad at me. Like, like, what are you doing? And I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You paid for this.
But then you say that to the interpreter, and then what happens? There's not a second interpreter, like.
There wasn't, so the judge told me, and I'm like, no, I can't do legal work, but we made it happen, so.
Yeah, language access, we have a whole team doing work around language access, training law enforcement, training interpreter, translators, and they always tell us we've been doing this work for 15 years and it's still just language 101 that we're doing over and over again because we still haven't been able to move past that. So.
Well, what I'm just thinking is, so we have a huge, we're dealing with a lot of Latino women, Spanish-speaking people, and so we're struggling with the police translating for that. I'm just thinking what would happen if it was somebody who spoke Tagalog or something. I just really don't even know. I mean, I'm sure they must. Well, I'm not sure of anything. I would say I'm sure they have a plan for that, but
no, they
you
don't.
know what?
And also, so I had this bright idea back in the day of let me take this interpreter training for the court and new, right? Not understanding the systems too well. I'm like, okay, I'll do it and I'll be an advocate for the client. But if you register to be a court interpreter, you don't just advocate, you advocate for whoever, or you interpret for whoever the court asks you to interpret for, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, all right, that makes zero sense because no way am I going to be objective. I mean, that much I know. But what I realized also was for Spanish, you're a court certified interpreter because your exam is in Spanish. You have to read and write, and you pass the exams, and then you take the ethics exam, and then hopefully then you go take the DV training as well. I was for Urdu, which is a pretty well-known language. My exam, it is a registered language. It's not a certified language. I had to take an exam, so I'm like, okay, now I better brush up on Urdu. It's been a while. Paper in English, oral exam in English, and I'm like, where is the Urdu in it? And now that was it. I was registered. I had to take the ethics class. So just to show you how lax the
that explains a lot. I mean, hearing that experience, some of the
okay,
things.
this was also 2004. I'm hoping things have changed since there, but I don't know.
Yeah.
That's really tough, and I mean, there's just so many languages. We've heard from Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco that they've had situations where their client needed this language and they couldn't find it. That's San Francisco, It's just something that there's not really an easy answer for a lot of the time.
We're seeing Mixteco too and other dialects
Yeah.
that
Right.
there is no interpretation for.
Well, even with the Spanish, the Spanish is so common here and it's such a high need, but I've gone to court with a few of the clients for the court advocacy department, and they have hired people that are from different areas. Not most of the people here are from Mexico, and a lot of the interpreters are not. So even their translation, they don't understand certain sayings, or so when there's certain threats in a slang term in Spanish, they're not translating appropriately. So even the one that is the most commonly interpreted here is still a failure in some areas.
And we've had to step in just like you in court.
It's really tough. I don't, I wish I had more answers.
But our language, truthfully, our language access plan is bare bones. It needs work, and that is for the DEI plan for the OES grant that they're having us do. That's one of the areas that I think we really want to try to set a goal to do better next year.
So, not making a plug, but ITARC, which is a part of our organization, which is the Interpretation, Translation,
and Resource Center?
Something. It's language access, and it is not just for AAPI. It's actually barely has any AAPI. They do nationwide work, mostly with Spanish. So if you need What in an ideal would for ourselves would also like a mixture of AWS's MLAM plus ITARC's working with courts and law enforcement and judges. So I would say definitely reach out to the ITARC department for like developing of a language access plan and then compliance and implementation. That they could
Yeah, it's one thing to
definitely
write it,
help.
it's another thing to actually do it. So,
True,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's also the shame of needing help. I think we addressed this a little bit earlier, but basically it's kind of like you feel like you know there's this kind of norm or expectation that you should be responsible for your family. You shouldn't need outside help, right? It's the kind of the honor, the face, you know, what you're putting, how you're being perceived by others. Men in AAPI households feel like they need to provide for their family financially and keeping them, you know, safe, housed, and things like that. And then the pressure on women is that they need to care for the well-being of their children, of the relationship, and things like that. And if either one of those is not happening, then that's reflecting poorly upon them. And so if somebody needs help from outside, whether that's social services, housing, or like, you know, DBSA services, that's a reflection that you've done something wrong, you've done something bad. And the question is, you know, I think, again, beyond just the API communities, just the US in general, why is it not normalized that sometimes people need help and it's not a reflection on what they've done or what they haven't done? Why is the kind of the burden on that person needing help to ask for the help and feel bad that they need the help? Why is it not just something that's available for everybody and just normal to need help? Because the reality is that the reason people need help is that a lot of our systems aren't accessible to them. Our society is not set up that everybody can succeed. So it's not, but people take it upon themselves, right? They're like, if I need help, that's shameful. That means I haven't done something right.
Because everybody else is doing so well, and I feel that a lot of it comes from this need for perfection. A lot of it comes from women, I'm speaking from a gender lens, having to be perfect, right? Having to know how to do their job, having to know how to take care, like raise perfect children, keep the house clean, like all these expectations which maybe society puts on us, but I think as women we also tend to put on us a lot. I think there's that, and now unfortunately one part of social media is everybody puts out their perfect lives on any part of social media, and so then it's like, all right, I'm failing completely, what am I doing wrong?
There's a lot of comparison.
Yes, there's a
with
lot
other
of
families, you know, like my friend's child is going to Harvard, my friend's child is an engineer, doctor. There's a lot of feeling like you need to present a very perfect face to the rest of the world because you're comparing yourself to your neighbor and they're comparing themselves to you, and it's kind of like a competition that nobody really acknowledges as a competition. And then of course, you know, men feel this pressure, women feel this pressure, and if you don't identify as a man or a woman, or if you're a man who loves men or a woman who loves women, you're not even part of this. Oftentimes it's worse for you, right? The expectations for you or the ostracization that you might feel. So for legal advocates, again, going pretty quickly, we talked about this all already, just to understand that a lot of times survivors do have to be bounced between system and system, and then, you know, you all as the advocate for that survivor, sometimes you are the voice for them, you're the bridge between all these different systems that they have to interact with. And that's why the advocate survivor relationship can be so important. That trust building can be so important in helping somebody feel safe and comfortable. This is a really valuable statement that I usually share this in all my trainings, but I found it really important, is that when this is a statement coming from a legal advocate that we spoke to in Hawaii, and they said, when I stopped showing up with a stack of forms, survivors started opening up, and this was a hard shift to make as someone with a legal background, but it made all the difference. The Pacific Islanders and the Native Hawaiians have this practice called talk story, where you basically, it's what it sounds like. You just ask somebody, you know, tell me about yourself, or tell me what happened to you, or tell me why you're here, you know, just very open-ended questions, and then you just let them talk, rather than saying, okay, what's your name, where do you live, were you know, like the check, you know, the form questions, right? That allows somebody to kind of feel comfortable telling at their own pace. That allows someone to feel comfortable opening up and narrating the story how they feel the most comfortable. And I love that practice. It's not just a practice that's used specifically in DBSA. They use it like it's just like an oral tradition, right? Like oral cultures. But I think it can be especially powerful in support groups and in intake even. Of course, it's difficult because in some situations there are forms that you have to fill out, but and this takes longer than just filling out the form, but I think it can be really powerful too.
There are many variations of it, and I think this is across the board. I don't want to say this is just for AAPI. I know it's also in the Latino community. We see it from a lot of the Black community, like the history of oral traditions. So when we started asking, first we also went mainstream when we got our first grant, and we had like the whole intake form, and we were asking for name and immigration and address and all of that. Realized people were not saying anything, so then we stopped, and then we just had people talk. And then we'd say we're taking notes for ourselves, and like every time they said something, we just underlined it, and then ended up doing the form later, which took double the amount of time. And then the other thing was, it was also not usually one-on-one, so it was like two of us. Now can you imagine 2 staff with 1 client and spending so much time, which meant that we didn't serve that many, but at least it was like 2 people were working together to get this one person's story, and then they went off to the housing or the legal or wherever. So that was one way of doing it.
Did you have a comment, or were you just agreeing?
A comment that's exactly what I'm doing during these weeks, because I do have to get some information from them, but before, when I first started to do them, I used to ask all these questions from the form, but lately I bring them in, you know, I explain our confidentiality, and then I just ask them, so tell me why you're here, and then I leave all those questions at the end, and I think it's working better to ask the questions when we're done, they're done telling me the story.
Yeah. And you may not need to even ask all those questions, because you've gathered that information through
I was going to comment on the same thing, just with specifically our minor forensic interviews, when we're meeting with family or the parent, to just talk about the process and stuff like that and get the intake information. I try not to use the intake form just because I'm familiar with what I need anyway, so I just kind of have a conversation with them and kind of like bring out those questions throughout, you know, and sometimes they offer that information anyway. But just for the same thing, because it just feels weird to just kind of go question by question off the intake form.
I just know what to say and what to ask, and it just works way better like that.
That's great. I mean, I love it. I love everything you all are saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll say with our department too, I think it's really important to start that way, because we also notice that we sometimes have people that we want, well, first for them to feel like they're making the decisions, but also not feel pressured. You know, we do have people sometimes in our office that are feeling that way, like I'm here because I'm feeling this pressure from other people that this is what I need to do, and just kind of starting in that way where they're able to share that, I think makes a big difference. And us kind of helping them walk through, giving them options, all of that.
Yeah, like they can tell what's important to them and you know how they want to tell their stories. Very empowering too. Yeah, I love it.
You all know this already.
Yeah, you do all. So okay. I mean, any quick questions? I think we can move on. Okay.
The only thing that I will lift up here will not happen in the Filipino community, but happens in mostly South Asians, Indians, Pakistanis, and the Hmong community, I don't even know if they're around here, is the transnational abandonment. It's where you bring, you get married, you're in this country, and then you go back home and you bring your wives. Mostly this happens to wives. You go back home and you just leave them there and you come back. And then they call and then that's it. And then they don't know how to come back. So that was a big thing for them, yeah.
Or it's like you're married here, but the wife, and usually it is the wife, is not a citizen, or doesn't have a green card, and then you're like, we're gonna go home to the country for the summer, we're gonna visit. Once you're there, you take away, her passport or her documents, and you come back with the children, and she's stranded there, and she can't, has no way of coming back and no way of like reuniting with her children.
And then can you imagine what a failure that is as a wife and as a mother, and to be left in a country where everyone is like, what did you do wrong that you don't even have your own kids with you? And that, how traumatic that is. Like that, it is, all abuse is wrong, but then there's some that are just extremely cruel, and that is that not knowing what's happening with the children.
Okay, so I think you all know this.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, go. I think you all know this, immigrant survivors especially don't want to report because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them if they report. Are they going to be deported? Are they going to be taken away? What's going to happen to their children? And often it's like, even if they're here, they have all their papers and all their documents, their partner might be telling them, you're going to be deported. You don't have your papers, you don't have your documents, and they might believe it. I mean, if you're not familiar with the system and you're there dependent upon your partner, you're going to believe it.
I think sometimes people are more scared of the system than they are of the abuser as well. I think there's that.
Yeah. So talking about language access, it's a pretty significant, the limited English proficiency is pretty common in the AAPI community, more so in some communities than others. In the Filipino community in American Canyon, in Napa County, we've heard from the community folks that we talked to that it's not as common. Limited English proficiency is not as common, so a lot of people do speak English. But in certain other communities, you'll have a lot of folks who don't speak English or don't speak English at a comfortable level for them, especially the elderly generations.
But one thing they said to us when we were listening to them is that even though they speak English, the representation in in our information that we send out is meaningful to them. So just the fact that we should do that even if they do feel comfortable speaking English.
Intentionally reached out, yeah.
Also, that if they speak Tagalog and English both fluently, sometimes their native tongue, or there isn't an English translation for whatever it is they're trying to say.
Right.
And so having the conversation in their own language,
More comfortable.
more
empowering.
Yeah, so that they can say what they need to say.
Yeah.
And also, not to forget, for the Filipino community, right, there's an American base there. So they'll pick up a lot of language, but to all extents, and I'm kind of comparing it to India, when you're colonized and you learn to speak English, and if you don't, then it's like, are you at a slightly lower rung? So the embarrassment of, yes, I do know English, but I don't know it very well might not come out. So having information in your own language is also very important for that reason.
Yeah, and to Gina's point, I mean, I say this all the time, is don't gatekeep the need for interpretation and translation. It's just because you do speak English and you can navigate, daily life, grocery store, even your work, doesn't mean you'd be most comfortable or most able to talk about trauma and talk about violence that happened to you and your family in English. There was last summer, do you remember that case at Raksha in Atlanta, an agency in Atlanta? It was basically a situation where a survivor was being asked in court, and she was saying that she needed an interpreter. But because she was able to speak basic conversational English, you could say her name, she could say her address, she could say very basic things. The judge was saying, well, you don't need an interpreter then, you've been responding in English. And so she ended up, I mean, it was this whole story, but she ended up being held in contempt by the judge because he was not believing that she needed an interpreter. And I think, yeah, I mean, being able to speak English isn't the same as, you know, being the most comfortable and most able to tell your story in English.
And so this is a tip, like I know someone was asking for tips. One way that I would say this is like, oh yes, you know, like not to make a big deal about, oh, you speak good English, and people get all irritated about that. I would get all irritated about that. But it's also, I would always lead with, we can have this conversation in English. Are you more comfortable speaking in another language? Because when I get upset or emotional or unhappy, I love speaking in my language. So that's like an in to let someone be like, okay, yeah, you know, go ahead. Like there's nothing to be embarrassed about.
Or sometimes they may start saying, okay, let's talk in English, and then they may decide later on,
Sorry,
just,
did you want to say?
No. Just some other small, not small, but you know, a couple of other considerations about working with interpreters is, I think I said this before, you know, in minority languages, often the concern is that the interpreter or translator does know the survivor, and that can be a real concern for the survivor and their safety. So, you know, if possible, redact their name from documents being translated. Try to get the name of interpreters beforehand so you can kind of check and make sure there's no risks and harms there. Dialects and regional differences. Yeah, I mean, you shared even in Spanish, right? There's like dialects, there's regional slang, there's Spanish spoken in different home countries. It's all different. So that's something to be mindful of. You know, not all Filipino people speak Tagalog. A lot of them speak, there's Kapampangan. is a language that's like a minority language in the Philippines that I think a significant number of folks here speak. I've been watching a TikTok about a guy who is a caretaker for his elderly grandma, and they speak Kapampangan. He says everybody who sees that we're Filipino automatically assume we speak Tagalog. I don't actually look at TikTok that much. I feel like I'm talking about it a lot, but it's not that much.
That's what we all say.
Yeah, I know. And then you're like sitting there, and then you look at the clock, and you're like, what time is it? How many hours is it? I think this is important because, like, a lot of times there's the academic, you know, very formal way of speaking. That even though it's the same language may not resonate with the survivor. And also to be mindful of how you're talking with the survivor. If you're using like really academic or really formal jargon, that can be a barrier for them. And then going beyond interpretation, translation. So, I mean, a lot of languages don't have terms like domestic violence, like gender-based violence, sexual assault, abuse, you know, marital rape, mental illness, even we said. So a lot of times advocates find it helpful to say things, you know, use terms that make sense in their language that may not be direct translations for terms. So this is a question, I guess, for you all who are doing this work. I mean, when you talk to survivors in English or in another language, what are some terms that you use to talk about, you know, violence in services that may not be these terms?
Well, I feel like sometimes in conversations with clients, when you're hearing their story and you pick up on the terms they use to describe it, you just end up replicating that. So like if they say it in a certain way, you pick up on that and you repeat it in the same way they told you.
Yeah.
I mean, if you speak the language,
Yeah.
it's difficult when you have an interpreter, but usually it's, you know, at least for like our Latino community, there's regional differences and education, everything plays into it. So like they said, they may not be comfortable with like very academic terms and they have their own way of saying it, and then you kind of like, oh, I haven't heard that, but I'm just going to replicate what you said.
Like mirroring.
Yes, mirroring.
And I think a lot of times, like, if you start right off the bat and you just say like, well, as a victim of domestic violence, you something, it might cause them to shut down. They're like, I'm not a victim of domestic violence. Like, they don't feel like they fully fit the definition. Or, yeah.
I was gonna say, I think even just in English, domestic violence is, people are like, oh, well, you know, I'm not in a domestic violence situation. He's never hit me. But then they describe this incredibly abusive, like, emotional, verbal, psychological situation. Because I think the violence word just conjures up, like, physical violence.
Right.
So I think, I know I do a lot of kind of explaining what that means, because I think a lot of people kind of start off by saying like, oh, that doesn't really describe my situation. So kind of explaining like, what do we mean when we say that can be really helpful.
I was like interpreting it too, like, I deserved that. Like, it wasn't actually like that even if there is actual violence, like, I brought that on myself, so like, I'm not a victim, right? That whole mentality,
like
mentality.
Kind of feeling like you did something to cause it, or feeling like it's your fault in some way, or shortcoming. Yeah. I think what I've heard a lot of advocates say is, rather than just kind of focusing on the terms, talk about the impact and the impact it's had on the survivor and how it's made them feel, versus just saying, well, domestic violence, sexual assault. And if you're talking through an interpreter, that helps them, I think, interpret too, if there is no direct term. Any other terms you found that are helpful, or not even terms, just like approaches or strategies?
I wanna, just a little thought bubble, I guess, like, so we work with, you know, middle school, high school, and college age youth, and so I think, you know, in the time that I've been here, it's definitely like helped when meeting with young people, and to know that like I'm already coming with things that I can't change, right? Such as my appearance, but it's like, how do I approach the room? Like, what is my demeanor? What am I wearing? How am I making people feel comfortable? Because even with talking with young people, they'll say, well, I'd rather talk to you than that person that's sitting in the office next to you. She wears crosses and she wears, you know, like certain religious things maybe, or things that we are wearing that, for example, I had a student say like, I don't want to go talk to them because they have like a cross, and like I feel like whatever I say is they're going to judge me, and like they're gonna be shook, or like, you know, in shock of what I have to say, or because they might not have the same lived experience as me, right? So it's not just about the language, but also like our presence and what that looks like.
And how you're appearing. And yeah, I mean, little things like that, that are not little, but like really important things, are things that you'd only pick up on when you work closely with that community, and when you learn from them, like what it is that they respond to. Yeah, I mean, sometimes, I think I spoke to an advocate who had a similar experience where he went into like a high school, middle school, and people were automatically standoffish, and he couldn't really figure out why. And then he realized it's the way that he was dressing. These are very young people, and often they don't want to talk to an adult who's coming in saying like, well, tell me about your relationships. They're not going to say anything, you know. There's one other point I wanted to make, but I forgot it, so it's okay. We can move on. I'd like to move in for the last almost hour. I'd like to talk about kind of education and prevention, and really reaching out to the local community, AAPI community, engaging with them, making sure that they know news is here, and news is welcoming and open to you, and not affiliated with law enforcement, and all of that. Some things to consider, first of all, is that depending on the community that you're going into, if you're going into high schools and middle schools, parents and communities might be resistant to you. I've spoken to a lot of advocates who say, like, we go into the high school and then we get calls from parents. We've had parents even stalk us and call our hotlines, call our helplines, and even try to figure out the addresses of our advocates, because they did not like what we were saying to their children. Because these advocates were teaching things around healthy relationships and consent, and sometimes for parents, they think, well, if somebody's talking to my kids about consent, then they're teaching my kids to have sex, and the parents didn't like that. And so I think that's something that's really important, is advocate safety for your advocates who are going into, the middle schools and high schools. Are they being taken care of? Are there processes and procedures in place to make sure that they're safe? They don't feel, triggered by whatever's happening, and that sort of thing.
Well, just walking through metal detectors now, going to school the other day just to go to your exam, and you have to think about it every time you walk through. You have to think about gun violence. It's just a whole, and I think about my staff, I think about those kids that have to do that every single day.
It automatically puts this atmosphere, this fear in the back of your mind, right?
Right here.
Yeah, or in the front of your mind, true. For curriculum, if you're talking with AAPI youth or AAPI communities, it's important for the curriculum to be culturally adapted. For instance, things like the term consent is something that may not resonate. That may not make sense to talk about consent in the same way that you might teach other communities about consent. So make sure you're kind of reviewing your curriculum and looking at it and seeing how can we adapt this for the community that we're working with.
Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, right. What's the alternative about consent, especially specifically?
You can say
the reason I put this example in particular is because we just did some listening sessions around consent and what consent looks like in AAPI communities, and how consent isn't really a thing that you think about as an AAPI young person growing up. It's not really a thing that you're taught. It's not really a thing that you're ever able to give or take away. The concept of personal boundaries is something that's seen as disrespectful in some communities, because if you have personal boundaries and you're putting yourself above the needs of the family and above the needs of the community. So when you go in and you say you should have consent in your relationships, I mean that it doesn't a lot of times it's not understood, or that might not resonate. So, and especially if you're in the school and you're teaching, make sure that you're asking somebody to touch, get touched, or make sure you're asking somebody, can I give you a hug? Then they go home into their families. They're not being asked by their parents or their grandparents. So, that just saying it may not be enough for API children. We have a whole report on the website that, if you're interested in this specific topic around consent and boundaries, it may be helpful to you.
So what would you say, Shirley?
Consent?
Yeah.
Rather than saying the term, consent, talk about, it's kind of like what we said about language, right? Talk about it in the impact that it has, talk about in asking permission, but also consent education, especially for AAPI communities, has to involve parents too, has to involve grandparents and communities too. It's not enough to just kind of tell the children and then expect them to go home and tell their parents no. Because the reality is that from the moment they were born, their parents told them what to do, and they never had a chance to say no, or to say, these are my boundaries.
Or didn't think about it. I didn't think about boundaries. There were no boundaries.
I mean, it's a lot of times it's thought of as a Western concept. It's consent.
I don't think I thought about boundaries either.
Yeah, I mean that's true. Yeah.
We were talking about this yesterday, the concept of closing the room door.
Yeah.
I shared a room with my siblings. Close the door and trap us in so we'd fight even more? We probably would, so that we wouldn't get smacked.
Parents don't knock.
Right, parents don't knock.
Let you close the door even.
Right. But I have a lot of friends who were born and raised here, who could not close the door either. Or if they banged the door shut, and I was like, oh, you banging the door shut? Let me just take the door off the hinges. You don't deserve a door. Things like that. And they're not Asian, so. I was like, okay, that sounds better.
Okay, so here, we talked, this is kind of where we've been trying to go, and I think we've had some conversation already about, so, you're here in Napa County, serving the community of Napa and American Canyon. And we just kind of wanted to kind of think together with you all around what is your particular community, AAPI community, and what are their needs specifically? Because we could stand here all day and say, well, this is what we know about AAPIs as a very broad group nationally, but that may not make sense for this community. So we wanted to pose some questions and think together around what are some strategies that you might undertake? What are some approaches to engage that community? So thinking about where are the Asian communities visible? Where do you see Asian folks in the community, Filipino folks or Chinese or Indian? Are they shopping in the same places? Are they worshiping in the same places? We know there's underutilization of healthcare, but are they coming to clinics and things like that? Who are the leaders of the community? And like Sarah said, both perceived or self-proclaimed leaders, and who are other important folks in the community? When they do need help, where are they going? Are they going to social services? Are they going to, if they're not coming to news, is there another agency they might be going to?
I would just say this was kind of the exact premise of the first year of our grant, was to answer all those questions.
Right. So
and
do you have
we really have
some answers?
Gina and I have identified community events that happen, people who are the identified leaders, people who are not identified leaders who work at Kaiser and have influence to get information, people who have told us about the church relationships, people who said, there's the social club is bingo for the
And
community and karaoke.
And t-shirts for the Lolas.
So, we're thinking, and then we ask, where do you go for help? And then we also did some digging into how many domestic violence reports were made to the American Canyon Police Department, and we identified a liaison within the police department who's white, but still, a point person. So we're still in that information gathering piece, but people have been very, very open in wanting to have conversations and give us suggestions and give us their perspectives, and have been so open about wanting to help. One of the things we wanted to do was recruit volunteers for our volunteer training, specifically from the community, and the first person we met to talk about that with was a woman who works at Kaiser, and she said, that's something I could do. I can be kind of the conduit to talk to people I know to see if they would be interested, and I could send them away. So just
You all met her, Irene.
Oh yeah.
Irene, she's wonderful. And then she told us, her own story about why she was so passionate about what we do, and so that was meaningful too. It wasn't just, people who didn't have a perspective about domestic violence, but also people who actually had the connection to the organization too, and why they wanted to help. So it's all been really powerful, and it's also helping us rethink, because I think there's been three areas. One is the community as a whole, one is this law enforcement piece, and then one of them is the connection to the schools and youth and education and prevention, and hearing a lot about that. So I think we're going to be, it's not just a one focus solution, it's going to be a lot of different ideas about how. So.
I think that sounds great. I think we get a lot of questions from organizations in areas where there's a small but growing AAPI population, maybe a new community, and they always ask us how do we reach out to them and how do we engage them? And our answer is always talk to the people in those communities that other people are listening to, that know about their communities, that are important in their communities, that may be leading events, not necessarily DVSA related, but just any community cultural events.
Yep.
And they will be your way into the community. And I think it seems like you're very fortunate. Sometimes we have situations where agencies have done that and reached out, and there's been resistance or there's been pushback. Like, we don't want to engage with DVSA services because we may have an idea in our mind about what that will mean. Or we may, we just don't want to talk about it. Maybe they might say, like, DV is not an issue in our community, we don't need to talk about it, or we don't want to talk to you about it, or something like that. So that does happen also.
So far, that's not been the experience, but we do want to be, you could see how if you did something that didn't, sit well with the community, how easily you could ostracize yourself from the community. So, we just want to be very thoughtful about our steps.
Yeah. What about the rest of you? Are you aware of or engaged at all with any AAPI, community cultural events, or know if there's? Yeah.
I can share. My daughters are half Lao Khmer, so they're an indigenous in Laos, indigenous tribe. Not Hmong, totally separated. They came over. Their family came over as refugees, but there's nothing here culturally here. So if anything, we go towards Richmond. If I want to share, if they want to be a part of anything, as a collective. As a community, it's all towards that way. Or Vallejo, if they want to have something similar to what they eat, because I can't prepare it. And so anyways, but Vallejo is a good resource. But Richmond, and I was looking at the religion. I'm getting red because just speaking about them. The religion, when they came over, they were Buddhist, but the people that sponsored them were Catholic. So they transitioned over to Catholicism.
Yeah.
But my daughters have since now, they were estranged from that as well. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of like in limbo a little bit because they have so many different, there's just so much. They have my background, and they have, it's just hard to find a community. Just watching them grow up to be young women is particularly, a little difficult. But I like that we're reaching out. That this is that it's something that's being addressed, that we're reaching out, and that American Canyon is getting representation.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to learn more about your thoughts around what's missing and
I think that's what happens a lot is, especially if they're from like a smaller, community, and there's no people of that community here, then it's like, where do you go for that cultural connection? And a lot of times you go to the other cities, or you find somebody who is not the same, but at least somewhat similar to you, not Laotian, and maybe like Hmong, or maybe,
because it's
the
very
closest.
different.
Right, yeah. And we've heard that too from the, Irene and other folks, is that if there's not a lot of AAPI thing, and there's just a group of Filipino people hanging out.
Yeah, all day.
Yeah. So I mean,
That's a good place to be.
good. I get to outreach and have hot French fries.
yes. I mean, just like that's really important, thing to know, right? Is that's where people are hanging out. How can you? I don't know if you can partner with McDonald's or something.
Food is very important, and I shared this even on the phone call, the listening session that we were doing impromptu, was that people who actually need services will not necessarily come to you, but you see the results maybe a month or two later. So we would go to all the religious events and sit there with the flyers, and no one would show up. And then he'd be like, why aren't people coming? And then realizing, why would people come? You don't want to announce in the community that I'm going here for, services.
Right.
Then we switched. Then we decided to go to the ladies' restroom and decided to put flyers that we printed out, and I put them by the wash basin. I went to go use the restroom. I come back, someone's dumped the whole lot in the trash. So that's a fail. Next time someone else came up with the brainwave of like taking the tear runs and sticking them to the inside. Obviously, because another reason for why they were thrown was you don't again walk in alone most of the times, I don't know, or at least in my community, you don't necessarily walk in alone. Like if you're at an event, you go like with whoever you're going with. Let's go use the restroom and freshen up or whatever. And but when you're in the stall, then obviously there you're alone, and it's easy to tear off and hide a tear off rather than a wallet card or a flyer. Same thing. We went to the ethnic stores. The storekeeper said, "Yes, I'll absolutely put a flyer in." And in my head, it was like, oh, at that time, people could take the flyer and tape it to the fridge. Not thinking culturally, not thinking what works for my culture, taking all the ideas that I got from mainstream and trying to use those. Why would I put up, if I were being abused, why would there be a flyer on my fridge saying that, right? So it was just like things like that. Then it's like, all right, let's just stick it at the ethnic store with the tear off, if at all. And then after 2 months or so, you're like, okay, so such and such ethnicity is calling, it must be because of that event. So it just, all this to say, it takes time. And clearly you can see on my part a lot of failures.
Well, and
Just to
who and
try.
how, like, I'm probably not gonna be the right person to go to the church in Vallejo. That would, I'm just thinking that's, so who and how is another thing to think about, and
Right.
ideally we find somebody who already has some connection with us, who goes to the church. So all that takes
Right.
time.
It does take time. And then the other thing that could happen, which we did talk a little bit about yesterday, was we have like a Korean church or a Taiwanese church community, so it's a project of ours, and they went through their church, or like 3 of their pastors, or they created a group of pastors that took the 40-hour DV training. But imagine even making that inroad in there and trying to talk and get past the let's pray together and forgiveness and patience to actually learning about DV and speaking to it, right? That is a small project in LA, but it's working, and I feel like that is one thing that could possibly be like just education of the pastor and or for if there's a different acceptance when someone you believe in deeply is the one who's saying go to news, they will help in whatever way that looks like. There's that piece, right? The other thing we did was we worked with I know Shirley headed the 16 Days of Activism with the Filipino Embassy in DC. And then we did a training for them. We actually did 2 trainings for them, and one training was
For men.
it was just a wash because they wanted the folks that were dealing with the cases that came their way wanted to do something, but it was the patriarchy was so deeply rooted that their generals and whoever were on the call, first of all, did not obviously like listening to a woman, so I asked an advocate to our director to speak up, and they basically was like, these are all who's male. They basically were like, well, these are all American issues. Like this doesn't happen for us. Like, this is all because they're here. Like okay.
And then were you gonna say something?
I have a question, and I hope I can ask how I'm thinking it.
Yeah.
So one of the things is getting buy-in from people that they see as leaders or trusted people to give information such as go to news. And then the other step would be like coming to news and then receiving services. And our idea is that we would ideally want to have somebody who maybe looks like them or can relate to them so that they feel that they can be open and trust that person. But I also see that it's a small community somewhat, and I also have heard that they might be reluctant to talk to people who might know their family or who might know their friends or things like that. So how would you all kind of suggest, the news part of it to go about that? Because we would be reaching out, hopefully, right, to somebody in their community. And then let's say, this one person is the one that says, I want to do this.
but that person is somebody who's so intertwined in the community that I would imagine could create a barrier for them to reach out, even if it is somebody who's represented in their community. So I'm trying to think through that, and I don't know if there's any suggestions while we have you here.
I don't think that ever came up at my tree.
It came up at Metri all the time, but then we were also like so big, right? So, I mean, there are lots of small ethnicities. Again, it actually comes down to the person. Obviously, we most of the folks at my organization look like me. We spoke many different languages, which worked out fine, unless people really did not want it known, right? So then, for example, if I was working with a client from Bangladesh, and she would be like, I don't want to speak to a Bangladeshi. I'd rather speak to someone who spoke Bengali from India. All right. Someone was like, I am sorry, I am not talking to you, you're Muslim. She was also Muslim. Like, I don't want to give my name, I don't want to give anything, I want to talk to someone who's not Muslim. She'd had a really terrible experience disclosing at the mosque. Understand that. So I think you are already doing it. So the buy-in piece with the faith-based community is the best place to go. Other than that, you're all fantastic advocates. You just show up as yourselves and you ask them what they want. And if they want to speak to someone who looks like them, then they do. But I think often, then you try and find someone then. But I think oftentimes people just need help. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is, right? And then they'll answer the questions on what it is that they need. So I think it just comes down to that. I know it sounds simplistic, but you've seen it in every other case that you're working on anyways.
Thank you.
I kind of have mixed feelings on that though, because some of the people we're talking to say, well, it was on the call with Elmer. They're not gonna go to a white person for help.
That's Elma's experience.
Right. But he actually has had people, like when he had the conversation with us, he was so happy that someone was doing this work and he didn't know about us, but he said that people do come to him, but they don't want to go outside of their community for help.
Some people don't, you know, and I've also heard from some people that they want to go to a white person, or if they feel more, comfortable, not comfortable, they feel, you know,
they won't be judged.
They won't be judged because they feel like, well, if you're American and you're white, you understand DB. And for some people, there's also a level of legitimacy, you know, that being a white person provides them. That's just the, you know, the reality is that for a lot of communities, it's like they respect things that are American. They respect things that are Western more than they would respect things from their culture.
I mean, to add to that, like, a lot of our, like, direct client advocates are, like, minority, like Hispanic, so I just don't know how they feel about that. I wonder if it would make them feel less or more comfortable.
Yeah, I think it really does depend on the person. You know, like sometimes, like Elmer says, they don't want to go to somebody outside the community because then you're like airing the dirty laundry of your community with somebody who is not, you know, of that. But sometimes, you know, they might feel more comfortable going to a Hispanic person, especially because, I don't think it's a secret, is that there's like so many similarities between the cultures. You know, a lot of Filipino people speak Spanish, and there's just a lot of overlap, and I think that might help some people. So it's kind of one situation of like, for each person that you're talking to, kind of see if you can gauge their comfort level, and if it seems like they're kind of shutting down or not wanting to engage, maybe see if, you know, would bring somebody, like another advocate in and see if that helps. It could even, maybe it's not even the ethnicity, it could just be, you know, like you shared the cross necklace, or the way that that particular person is dressing, or just something small they said. It could be anything, it could be.
I kind of see that, like, actually, you know, like, I think almost we're overanalyzing it in a way, because when they come into shelter, you know, maybe you have a client that I'm their case manager, but they like really gravitate to Sarah, and they're like, where's Sarah? Or like, you know, my coworker Lali, who works with kids, like the kids want to see her, so it's like, where is she? You know, so it can be personality. It could be, and I've noticed like we've had clients who are like so they're like African American and they go to Sarah like versus me, you know, like, and it's just I don't think it. I think it's more like who they made the connection with.
Yes.
And then they gravitate towards that person. So
I was gonna say, and
Yeah.
I think sometimes we also can trace it back to who had that first contact on the helpline with them, because
Yeah.
that's their safe person who knows them.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking like what you said, sort of, you know, sometimes we are overthinking it, because I think it's really about, I mean, obviously it's bigger than this, but
Yeah.
like, how do you make a person feel when they come to you? So maybe they're like, oh, really prefer to talk to somebody who looks more like me, but this is the person I have, who, you know, in front of me, and then it's up to, you know, that person, let's say me, to, you know, how do I make this person feel?
Yeah.
Am I hearing what they're saying? Am I being respectful, or am I just, you know, and obviously everybody's different, so that may not work for everybody, but I do think a lot of times, you know, it's how we make people feel when they do show up, how much they're heard.
I mean, and it's sometimes, like you said, personality, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
people just don't like
That's
somebody,
true.
you know.
That's true.
You might be
That's
too
true.
bubbly for them, or
Yeah.
you might
Or
be a little
like-
too quiet.
Yeah.
Remind them of their mom.
Yeah.
You know, like whatever.
Yes. That's a good point too.
I was gonna say, I'm so happy you brought up the overanalyzing piece to this, because at the end of the day, it's someone who's overanalyzing on both ends. At the end of the day, someone needs help. You are fantastic advocates. This is what you do for a living. Doesn't matter who they are, what they are. You're not going to learn everything. They'll tell you what they need, right? But then I found myself, I'm like, what? Now I'm overanalyzing. The younger community gets to hang out with the Hispanic community in schools. I don't know what the make of American Canyon is. I'm guessing they're mostly Latino and now Filipinos. So there's already that connection. We're going with this to like, depends on who comes when into this country. They could be second, third, fourth generations who'd have no problem with language, with culture, with whatever, right? So, I think it sounds really silly, but it's like, what do you do when you go out in other communities? You'll do the same thing there too. And there are stages of folks coming in different places. But then again, like, what are some other ways of trying to find folks? We spoke about the faith community. What about the ethnic media? Like, even, what was this person's name? Elmer?
Elmer.
Did not know much about news, right? So maybe putting out ad in whatever the ethnic media is. Is it a radio? Is it a print? Back in the day,
Nurses
Mystery.
Association.
Right, yeah, the Nurses Association. I know the Chinese community uses a lot of WeChat. I know the South Asian community has like this whole WhatsApp thing going. But I know the older Filipinos use, the ones that I know, like in my friend circle, the older ones use Viber. I don't even think anybody uses that anymore. The younger ones use Facebook Messenger.
It's like Facebook groups too.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard that young people nowadays don't use Facebook anymore.
Oh, not
That's
at
like
all.
for old people.
Yes, I know, I'm the
So-
old people. As per my child, Insta is the place
That's
to
what, yeah, I know. But for my mom, she's on WeChat like every single day. Like she gets all the fake news, she gets all the real news, like everything she gets from WeChat. And so like if that's what this community is using, that's could be an important road, is like, you know, seeing how that fits in. Thinking organizationally, I mean, so we talked about this, we talked about outreach materials and making sure, you know, even if language, you know, even if a lot of communities, the community here are very comfortable in English, are your materials specifically targeting or welcoming to them? Staff or volunteers, you know, like sometimes folks might feel comfortable going to the person who looks like them. But if there's only one Filipino person on staff or one volunteer, and you're sending all the Filipino people to them, that could be a real burden on that person, or that can, be tokenizing, right? Like you don't want to be the one Filipino person, and then you're getting sent to all the outreach things because they want to see you at the tables or anything like that, or like we said, like. Survivors may not want to go to their community. I think I'm a good example of that. Growing up, I saw so many isms in the Chinese community that I grew up in. I saw so much patriarchy, so many isms, so like ableism, classism, racism. Like, I spent a long time in my like early adulthood. I would have never gone to a Chinese agency because in my mind, it was like, that's where you're gonna find all the isms. If I had needed help, I would have gone to a mainstream. I would have gone to, anything but Chinese, like anything that's coming from my community. So even though I didn't have that same like fear of, like retaliation from my community, it was still, I didn't want to go there because it's a perception, like I wanted to get away. And I think a lot of times young people feel that way too. I think that's the end of our presentation, and we do have a lot of time, 15 minutes or so, for any questions about anything, about any of this engagement piece, or any cultural pieces, or anything that we can help you with. Yeah.
Oh, me.
Go ahead.
As far as material goes, sometimes we do want to present materials, like I can just think of a shelter, and we don't have like a staff person that can translate it. Do you recommend any like program or way that we can reach out to someone to translate accurately in the language, like say Tagalog?
Yeah.
For like written material.
Yeah, written materials.
I would reach out to like Asian Women's Shelter.
Okay.
Or there's
Sacramento.
That's
Oh,
what I was gonna say. My sister's house.
My sister's house is another one.
Sacramento.
I feel like there's already a lot of material out there, and it could be in other languages as well. So there's no need to recreate material. But as advocates, I really hope, and I wish that at some point we could have like a space for advocates to kind of network and we do that with the culturally specific programs. So we end up working with a few Asians, a few Hispanic, and a few African organizations. And even though the languages are very different, there's a cross-pollination of ideas and issues. And I feel like in California, we're lucky enough that there are so many multicultural organizations or representation that can happen.
So see if they have somebody like an advocate bilingual that could translate.
Yeah.
If not, then what we've done is we've gotten things translated at a firm, just translation firm, and then we pay advocates who speak, Tagalog, if that's the language, to review. Because sometimes they'll catch things like, this is not how I would say it, or this is not how, because the translator, aren't advocates, so they may not know. So it's always useful to have that review.
I would also say you can always ask Cal OAS to put out a whole, to always have like a certain amount of funding for translation for the organizations. You can also talk to CPDB, tell them we want this material translated because that is a huge population that is here. We are your member organization. This is a need we see. So it's not that everything that you have to do yourself, but like ask other people to put in the money in the state of California to do that for you.